Welcome to Presentation 10, where we're looking at the book of Leviticus. Before we move forward, let's as usual just look back to the previous presentation. Central theme in Leviticus is that God is holy. He's different because he's ethically and morally perfect in every way. And because of that, we are called to be holy, called to reflect something of his nature. Holiness is not some vague idea. Holiness is practical. It's expressed in life quality. Life quality among God's people that reflects God's nature himself. The call to that was given to the people of God in the days of Leviticus. Quality of living. And it's because this reflects God's nature. We are God's people. And that means, among other things, that we don't copy the practices of the people groups living around. In the case of the people of Israel, copying what they'd left in Egypt or copying the practices of the people group who were currently living in the land. There's a very deep message for us today. We have to be distinctively different, not negative, positively different. That's holiness. The book of Leviticus must be interpreted in terms of the culture of the people of that time. When they did reach the land, they lived in small communities, and these were close-knit, extended family groups. When something went wrong, the danger was that it could end up with revenge being taken. Now that was the pattern of much of the cultures of people groups round about. There were no legal structures, no police force, no judges, no prisons. And these communities, when something went wrong, the senior men of the community would meet together with the entire community and try to give a direction on the best way forward. That's the picture of the culture of people of that time. The community as a whole was responsible for upholding the standards of the community. And Leviticus must be seen against that background. It's one complete cultural package, very different from the cultures that exist today. The supposed law, which is more a set of directions, that's encased in the book of Leviticus, must be seen against that background. Here was a desert people who'd escaped from slavery. They didn't know much about God, and they didn't know where they were going and what faced them. They had many doubts and much confusion. Most of them were illiterate. God was giving them directions for the lifestyle to get through the desert experience and to prepare them for what they were facing when they went into the land. And much of Leviticus is built around the central place of Yahweh, the name for God in the Old Testament. Get God back to the center of your community life. Things start to drop into place. Now Yahweh was very different from the gods of other people groups, which if we're honest were just human inventions. God was a single God, the God who created everything. He was the only God, but the word implies a God of relationship, a God who wants relationship with his people, wants his people to live his way because that's the best way. He made us. But a God who is holy because he's marked out by perfection, perfect ethical purity. And that's why there's such a central importance on cleanness and holiness throughout Leviticus. Here are pictures of lifestyle that was going to reflect the quality of God's people as they lived reflecting the God they worshipped. The people of God were to be different, and they were to reflect the nature of God in the practical things of life. Now with that background in mind, let's move forward into the next section of Exodus 21 onwards. I have quoted this passage several times, or a little bit of it. Now the bit that I've kept quoting is that Moses was told to tell the entire people group of Israel, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." All of them. The quality of their lifestyle was to be different, the holy nation. Kingdom of priests, they were to be there to make God known to the people groups round about and be the means, the go-between, such that these people groups could respond to Yahweh, the God of creation. But it's set in a context. Everything is God's, the whole earth is mine. All people groups are of equal value to him. But he's going to reach the world through this particular people group. That was their destiny, that was their role, and everything is built to that end. But there's conditions. He was told to tell this to the people. That was their destiny. Now in many ways they failed, but gloriously they succeeded, because from that nation group came Jesus, who has transformed the people groups of the world. But the condition was that if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, I'm taking you to be my people. I'm going to provide for you. Now respond. Live quality lives, holy lives, lives that reflect my nature, so that I, Yahweh, will be made known to the people groups round about. Their destiny was conditional on obedience. Now, when we look at what the priests were doing, which is the theme of today's presentation, it must be seen in the context of that entire picture. The nation, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The priests were a means to an end. They were to help the people forward to that goal and to fulfill that destiny. A little bit of history. One tribe, the tribe of Levi, descended from Levi, one of the sons of Israel himself, Jacob. This tribe was set apart to be priests. They weren't given any agricultural land, and for their survival they relied on the gifts that were brought in as part of the sacrificial system. One of their number was the high priest. The first high priest was Aaron. Now it descended down through the family line, through the eldest son. Now the priests undertook many duties, but Leviticus is focusing on this, their central role. They managed the entire sacrificial system. The sacrificial system was a magnificent, vivid picture of the reality of God, the reality of the human condition, and what we need to do about it. So it's centered on that. Now, I want to focus on that because that's the focus of chapters 21 and 22. But remember, it starts with that. God is morally and ethically perfect. Everything he does is perfect. We describe that as holy. And we definitely are not holy. We're rebellious. Human beings, because we've been given free will, so often we decide we can run our lives our own way. We know what's best. And you see that in today's society all over the place. Contradicts God's nature. And that produces this relationship problem. Now remember, Yahweh, implicit in the word, is a God of relationship. So here we have a problem. Now the sacrificial offerings give us a picture. They stress the perfection and holiness of God, hence the emphasis on cleanness. It's a picture, a vivid picture. The sacrificial system stresses the seriousness of our human rebellion. God can enable us to put it right. Only He can do it. But we've got to respond. The response is bringing our best. On behalf of a family group, the man would lay his hands on the head of the animal, which is an admission we've got it all wrong, we're rebellious. And the animal was sacrificed. If you like, it's an outward expression of our inward response to God. And the sacrificial system is a picture of our reality to a people group who couldn't read or write. That's always true. God made us and God gave us free will. He will not therefore force us to do things, because that would contradict His creation. He made us free. He provides for us. He invites us. We have to respond. We must be willing to having things put right. He does the putting right. But we've got to be willing. And again, the whole sacrificial system speaks of that. It illustrates the whole thing beautifully, stressing the wonder of the nature of God, the human predicament of our rebelliousness, and the consequences of our rebellion are serious. And it's a picture of how this can be put right. And God can work in our lives and enable us to live lives that are quality lives, lives that reflect Himself. We can be holy because He is holy. Now the priests, their role was to allow that to take place. That's why they were set apart from the ordinary business of agriculture. They had to carry out all the procedures correctly because they all vividly spoke of the truth behind them. They were to act as a go-between between the holy, perfect God, Yahweh, the self-existent one, and this rebellious people. They didn't deserve God's favor. They didn't deserve God's help. They didn't deserve even to be rescued from slavery or to be given a land. But the role of the priests was to carry this out and to enable the people to move forward and to understand more and to move into their calling of holiness. Now let's, with that background, look at chapters 21 and 22. You may want to have your Bibles open because I'm not going to present the actual text. I'm going to present the framework for it. It's in 6 parts, each of which ends with the statement, I, the Lord, am holy. I who make you holy. How much that stresses the nature of God, His separation, His perfection, His ethical and moral purity. And He wants that we reflect that nature. And He can enable it to happen. I who make you holy. We can't do it by self-effort. Nobody can. We can want it to happen. And when we want it to happen, when we're willing, there is a wonderful God who can make us holy. God who Himself is perfect. Only God can make us holy. We try to do it by self-effort. We end up in disillusionment because we keep falling flat on our face sooner or later. If we recognize we want it and recognize we need help, God's help, then we get to the starting line and things can happen. We must be willing to be made holy. Now these are fundamentally different teachings from any other people group at that time, or indeed any other religious tradition that exists today. Most religions make an emphasis on self-effort to please some god or gods. You can see that most vividly in Islam. Everything is built around self-effort, rule-keeping, meticulous adherence to a set of rules. Now, when we look at the great principles behind the Old Testament, and Leviticus encapsulates them beautifully, yes, it stresses the perfection and holiness of God. But it recognizes that we can't solve the problem ourselves, but we must be willing. Then God can enable it to happen. I am the Lord, I who make you holy. Now the 6 bits. There is restrictions on what priests were allowed to do for mourning for others. Restrictions on who they might marry. High standards are set. So, for example, they're not to be involved with dead bodies outside the immediate family. Again, this strange concept of cleanness that speaks of God's perfection. It stresses there's to be no religious body mutilation. Cutting of the hair down the sides, or mutilating the flesh in some way. Now, both of these were part of other religious traditions. And they weren't allowed to marry people who were divorced or who had been previously prostitutes. The standards set for them were high, but the standards set for the high priest were even higher. Stresses their significant importance. No involvement with death at all, devolved to others. They must appear appropriately. It's not a casual job. And their marriage was only to someone who is unmarried, an unmarried lady from within the people group. So important because the eldest son would become the high priest. Again, this strange stress that seems to us so unfair. But if a priest had any physical impediment or any temporary illness, he couldn't act as a priest for a while. But he still had to be given his share of the food that the people would bring in as part of their sacrificial system. Again, this is a picture, not a rule, a picture. A picture of the perfection of God. Certain restrictions on what food they could eat that was brought in and when. If you could become contaminated with anything unclean, then the priest was to withdraw from duties temporarily and make sure he'd washed before he returned to duties. Again, stressing the holiness, the perfection of God. Food was brought in. It was for the priests and their family, but there was a danger that hangers-on might kind of live off these food gifts that were brought in. So it defines who the food can be given to. Practical. And then finally it speaks about the animals. The priests would have to make sure that the animals sacrificed were the best and not outwardly damaged in any way, or someone had just palmed off an animal that was of limited use to them. People brought their best because that signifies our response to God. There's the set of the 6 parts. But again, it all stresses the standards for the priests were set very high, higher than for the ordinary people. This is very important for us today. Those who are in any spiritual leadership in any way amongst the people of God today, the standards demanded of them have to be high because they have a task to help the rest of us forward in moving towards our destiny as the people of God and making Jesus known to the world around. And they have to be above reproach and seen to be above reproach. That is a very, very important principle that we have lost so much today. The sacrificial system, it's a vivid picture. You can see much of this picked up in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, when you can see how much of the picture is fulfilled and completed in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. Because this picture speaks about divine holiness. There is an awesomeness about the God who made the universe. And as modern science has uncovered just the sheer nature and size of that universe, the God who made it, we become more aware of his awesome power and greatness. But he is perfect, ethically, morally perfect. And we're not. And the sacrificial system speaks of that and shows the people how they can respond, not in fear, but positively, so that they too might reflect something of the holiness of God. And all of this is fulfilled in the New Testament, and Hebrews speaks of this. Jesus, who is the perfect high priest, fulfilling all the destiny of the priestly system, but he was also the perfect sacrifice described in this chapter. And that's the goal of Jesus, that we, his people, he might work within us by his Spirit, that our lives might become more like him in the practical things of life. Because when we live for Jesus, when we reflect his nature, when we show the way he lived and how he treated others, then we make an impact. We make God known. And we become priests and a holy nation. And throughout Leviticus, this repeated demand for outward holiness. Call it cleanness. Perfection, outward perfection, the best of all. And all of that is the picture that speaks of the inner demand for wholeness and perfection, with moral and ethical purity, because that speaks of the God we worship, the Yahweh of the universe. And everything in the sacrificial system points to that. And Jesus fulfills it. I'm going to leave chapter 23 because that will take a presentation on its own. I'm going to jump to the first part of chapter 24. Let me just put the text up. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning continually. Outside the curtain that shields the ark of the covenant law in the tent of meeting, Aaron is to tend the lamps before the Lord from evening till morning continually. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. The lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord must be tended continually." It goes on, "Take the finest flour and bake 12 loaves of bread, using 1/5 of an ephah for each loaf." That's a volume. "Arrange them in 2 piles, 6 in each pile, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. By each pile put some pure incense as a memorial proportion to represent the bread, and to be a food offering presented to the Lord. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in the sanctuary area, because it is a most holy part of their perpetual share of the food offerings presented to the Lord." The focus of chapters 21 and 22 is the duties surrounding the sacrificial system. Here are more duties that the priests had to fulfill, and the high priest specifically. Let's look at the structure because it helps us to understand what's going on. We saw in a previous presentation the tabernacle, which was a kind of portable temple, and the temple that was eventually built in Jerusalem and dedicated by Solomon centuries later followed the same structure and style. That is the inner bit. We have focused on the laver where the priests would wash. The huge altar, you came in at the front from the east, that was the entry point, and the altar would be dramatically big. It had to be, size of the sacrifices being offered. Now let's look at that bit, because chapter 24 is focusing on that bit. So let's look at that inner bit, known as the holy place or the tent of meeting. Now there's an inner bit to the inner bit, and here was housed the Ark of the Covenant, entered through curtains. Outside that there were three main objects. There was an incense altar, signifying the prayers of God's people, not dealt with in this chapter. A table of the bread of the presence, as it's sometimes called, and a lampstand. And of all of this would be a tent with a roof on it, so it would be relatively dark at night, totally dark. The lampstand would be the source of light. Bread was put on that table arranged in 2 piles, 12 loaves, and it was renewed regularly. Probably, we cannot be certain, that the bread there a reminder of the covenant of God with the 12 tribes of Israel. That God would be the God of this people. A promise that had been made to the ancestor of the nation, Jacob, who became called Israel himself. The 12 tribes. God would be with them, the bread of the presence. The lamp was critical because it was the only source of light. And it must give light around the clock. So it had to be kept lit during the night, which meant that more oil, olive oil, had to be fed into it, so it didn't go out. Speaking of the permanent light of God's presence. And oil, of course, is so often a symbolism of the Holy Spirit. Many of these ideas are picked up in the New Testament. Now that's the background of this section. And again, these are visual reminders. Fundamental principles run behind it. Yahweh, the self-existent God of Israel, but a God of relationship. A God who promised to be with his people if they would respond to him, symbolized by the bread of the presence, renewed regularly, symbolized by the light that was kept lit even in the hours of darkness. God would not leave his people, but people who were so often in a rebellion. Here are pictures, because this is a picture showing the means by which we can approach God. It speaks of God's nature, it speaks of God's covenant, it speaks of God's presence, it speaks of God's provision, but it speaks of our need to respond. The priests had to put the bread in regularly. They had to keep the lamp lit all night. Fundamental principles. It goes back to that. Speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. I am the Lord your God. Spoke of the nature of God. Spoke of the promise that God would be their God. He would be with them at all times. But the call and requirement that God's people will be holy by the quality of their living, their lifestyle, how they treat each other, and how they treat people outside the nation. We saw before that's just 3 words in the original language. I, Yahweh, Elohim of you. Holiness is not some vague idea where we dress up in fancy clothes, put our hands in a position of prayer and wander around looking serious. No, there's nothing to do with that. Holiness is practical. God's holiness is expressed in his perfection. He calls us to be nothing less. Holiness is expressed in life quality. A life quality among God's people that reflects the very nature of God himself. And one of the tragedies of the people of God in the West today is that we lost that. We lost that long ago. And until we recapture that truth, we're going to keep on declining, being marginalized and disappearing. The great call to the people of God in the West today is to capture again the holiness of God and to commit ourselves to seek to reflect his nature and to be holy because he is holy, and to live the quality of life that makes an impact because it reflects God himself. The sacrificial system reflects all of this. It reflects the nature of God, human rebellion and human access to God. And the priests had a central role in this to run the system because the system spoke of truth. And the people relied on these priests to do it right. Hence the emphasis here, a meticulous emphasis on doing things right, because it's a vivid picture of truth. They carry great responsibility. That's the great thrust of chapter 21 and 22, with a little bit added on from the later chapter 24. And we need to recapture again the leadership of the people of God who serve the people of God. The leadership's got to recapture these great truths so that Jesus may be made known. And we will fulfill the role of being a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A magnificent message from Leviticus. In the next presentation, we're going to go back and look at this chapter 23, which focuses on the great festivals of the nation.